Welcome to Life Talks Virtual, hosted by Halton Alive. The purpose of our Life Talks conferences is to gather, learn, and envision a better way forward when it comes to life issues. As an organization, we believe in promoting the value of human life through the power of education and resources. We approach these issues through truth and a lens of grace and compassion. We know that when people have the right knowledge and community to surround them, they're able to make choices for life, even in the most difficult circumstances. Today we will be sharing a presentation from Jonathon Van Maron at one of our past Life Talks conferences. Jonathon is a public speaker, writer, and activist. He has served for more than 10 years as Communications Director at the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, a national pro-life organization. He has delivered speeches and lectures on a wide range of cultural issues in Canada, the United States, and across Europe. His work appeared in First Things, National Review, The American Conservative, Christianity Today, The National Post, and he is a contributing editor to the European Conservative, one of Europe's premier journals of politics and culture. Jonathon is the author of several books, including The Culture War, Seeing is Believing, A Guide to Discussing Assisted Suicide, and most recently, Patriots, The Untold Story of Ireland's Pro-Life Movement. Jonathon holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in History from Simon Fraser University. Enjoy today's feature presentation.
So first, I was told to make the talk encouraging and then told what the topic was. And there's not a lot of good news on this particular subject. So what I'm going to try and do is give you a bit of a lay of the land of where we are in the current situation in Canada. And then the best I can do with regards to encouragement is not to give you any specifically encouraging developments, but give you a series of arguments that we have now been using in public to change the minds of those around us. Every argument I will be discussing with you in this presentation are arguments not that we think are great arguments, they're arguments we've specifically tested on people and used to change people's minds. One of the reasons it's so difficult to be encouraging on this particular topic is because pro-lifers are cursed by having the horrible experience of seeing all of our negative prophecies come true. Now, I remember in the lead up to the Carter case and the lead up to the passing of the legislation formally legalizing euthanasia and assisted suicide, that pro-lifers explicitly, but also a lot of people who don't share our worldview, including Andrew Coyne, most notably in the National Post, were laying out all of the ways that assisted suicide legislation could and most likely would be abused. And now what we see is that with each new case hitting the media, with each new case that reveals once again that all of these predictions are in fact true and ongoing, that nobody seems to actually care. Because the reality is those who advocated for this legislation in the first place were disingenuous when they said they particularly cared about safeguards. And I'll give you the most recent example, which was on October 29, 2021, when Donna Duncan, a 61-year-old nurse and mother, died by lethal injection. This is one of the first cases now in Canada that's being actually investigated by the police. And the reason the police are investigating it is because Donna Duncan's two daughters complained to the police and stated that she had been approved for assisted suicide despite the fact that she was depressed at the time, despite the fact that she should not have qualified, and despite the fact that this happened against the wishes of her entire family, who wanted to come around her, who wanted to assure her that her life was worth living and ensure that they had the chance to make her feel this in every imaginable way. And most notably, one of the reasons that Donna Duncan had applied for assisted suicide is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of the physiotherapy that she needed after a car accident was not available to her because so many things were canceled. We're starting to see now a long list of cases of people who apply for assisted suicide, not because the condition they have is not treatable, but because they could not get the treatment for the past 2 years. And of course now there's a massive backlog in the different kinds of treatments that people need. Just to give you an idea of how terrible the situation is. And if I get worked up at a couple of points during the presentation, it's because many of the people that I love the most in the world, members of my immediate family, have suffered with crippling depression for years. It genetically runs in my wife's family and in my own family. The likelihood of one of my children suffering from it is very high, simply based on the genetic lottery that they did not win. And it's people like that who are being recommended for assisted suicide, which they can get within a matter of hours. Donna Duncan applied for assisted suicide and received it 48 hours later. 48 hours later. Do you know how long it takes to get a psychiatrist for a mental health issue? In Alberta, it's more than 3 years. In Ontario, it used to be 2. It's now longer, and I know this from painful experience with, again, many members of my family. If you do manage to get into the office of a psychiatrist, you're lucky if you get maybe 15 or 20 minutes, not because the psychiatrist doesn't care about you, but because he's trying to get as many people through the door as possible, because there's almost nobody there to actually care for people who need it. I actually asked a medical professional at point blank during a particularly frustrating time a year and a half ago, and I said, so do people just die because they can't get an appointment with a psychiatrist? And he said, all the time. That was true before assisted suicide was available. That was true when people would take their lives into their own hands because they simply, essentially died deaths of despair because they could not access treatment that they needed. Now, the government will both fund and facilitate it for you, which is a radically different state of affairs. I picked just one story. I could have picked a half a dozen others. Checking social media right before I gave my talk, I see that one of the head doctors with Canadian Physicians for Life has just posted 2 more stories from the past month of people with perfectly treatable conditions who could not get treatment for it and instead have opted to commit suicide with the permission of the government. Since the legalization of assisted suicide in Canada, we've seen more than 25,000 people opt to die by suicide. That is a very, very big number. And what you'll see, of course, is the government say this is going to be used in rare circumstances. This is something that's necessary for those in extreme suffering. And then they constantly expand the regime. And of course, when everything we predicted comes to pass, they say, we never really cared to begin with. Not in so many words, but this is why you see in Canada, as of March of next year, Canada will become one of the only nations on earth that will allow medical aid in dying, or MAID as they call it, for people whose sole underlying condition is depression, bipolar disorder, personality disorders, schizophrenia, or even post-traumatic stress disorder. Now consider how perverse this is for just a moment. When somebody has a mental illness of some sort, and one of the things that drives me nuts in the conversations about mental illness is that everybody understands that if you're a diabetic, you need insulin. Everybody understands if you need a liver transplant, it's because your liver's breaking down. Everybody understands if you've had a heart attack, it's because your heart's been affected in some way. But when we talk about mental illness, people seem to think that this takes place in some vague fantasy world that we can't quite grasp. When the reality is that a mental illness is when a very specific physical organ in your body is suffering from an illness, and that happens to be the brain. Now, it is true that because we have so little of the brain mapped, we know less about mental illness than we know about other illnesses in many ways, which means treating different forms of mental illness is often an imprecise science. It's why people often have to try multiple antidepressants or medications before they find something that works. It means that treatment is often extensive while they're trying to determine, is the mental illness brought about by a chemical imbalance that is a result of trauma, or is this, as it is in the case of my family, a genetic trait that's been passed down for generations? There are many different ways that mental illness manifests itself, but I think we treat mental illness as scary because we don't realize that mental illness is an illness affecting an organ the same way other illnesses which affect other organs are serious, which is why we're so bad at talking about mental health. It's like, well, those people are crazy. If it's in your head, when people say in your head, they don't mean in your brain. They mean you're kind of imagining it a little bit, right? And so this is one of the reasons that we're so terrible at talking about mental illness in general. But now consider for a moment how unbelievably perverse it is when you recognize that somebody who is suffering from schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, if they're suffering from one of these things, what it means is the very organ that makes decisions, the very organ that interprets the world around us and that helps us understand things properly, this has been afflicted by an illness. This is the organ that is in some way seeing the world in a way that is not as it is. And as such, allowing that person to use that organ to make the decision to kill themselves, funded and facilitated by the government. I am so sick of hearing people talk about choice when the people making the choices are making those choices with the organ that is sick. This is not complicated. I have so many people tell me, well, the issue of assisted suicide, it's a really, really complicated issue. I'm like, it isn't really that complicated when you boil it all the way down. Almost every one of us in this room knows somebody who has tried or successfully committed suicide. Everybody in this room knows somebody who's experienced suicidal ideation at some point or another. If you don't know who that person is, it's just because they haven't told you. I promise that all of you know somebody who has experienced suicidal ideation. And what the government is saying about the law that is coming into effect in March of next year is that one of the ways you qualify for government-assisted, funded, and facilitated suicide is feeling suicidal. That if you feel suicidal, it's an indication, of course, that you are suffering enormously. And anybody who knows anyone who has felt suicidal knows, of course, they are experiencing immense suffering. That's why they don't want to be, is because being is extraordinarily painful. That is what despair is like. Is looking into something and feeling nothing but pain looking back, and not necessarily wanting to abandon anyone or leave this world or deny that there are many beautiful things, but just not wanting to be anymore because existence is so horrifying and painful. And of course, the response to that is that we must do everything in our power to address the reasons for that despair and to address the reasons for that suicidal ideation, not inform them, as our government has, against the objections of disability advocates, against the objections of psychiatrists and mental health professionals, that instead, the fact that they feel this way means that they qualify for assisted suicide. What this means is that somebody says, I am suicidal, I'm better off dead. And the literal response under these new guidelines from the government is, I agree with you. I won't ask you guys to put your hands up because I know it's a private question, but I have talked to many people who have felt suicidal ideation. I've talked to many people while they were experiencing it. I found somebody halfway through an attempt and stopped them. And there's a lot of people in my life who wouldn't be here if they'd had access to this back then. And there's a lot of people in your lives that wouldn't be around either if this had existed for the last 20 years, as opposed to being some months in the future. So one of the things that I want to go over first is the legal implications the cultural implications of legal euthanasia and assisted suicide. And then I want to talk about a couple of the best arguments against this. And these are arguments, again, that we have used and that are very effective. And I'll give you a brief idea of how we use these arguments. When my colleague Blaise Elaine and I were looking at what the best arguments against assisted suicide were, and this was actually just after the Carter case had been decided, but before the legislation had been formally passed, he would keep on asking me questions like, well, why are you against euthanasia? And I'd, of course, give these explicitly Christian reasons, because I think those are the best reasons to be opposed to it. Those are not, however, the arguments that are the most persuasive to the most number of Canadians, because does anybody want to guess the percentage of Canadians that attends any form of religious worship monthly? And by any, I don't mean just churches, I mean gurdwaras, temples, synagogues, mosques, Wicca circles at midnight in the forest. They don't worship on Sunday, though. Almost bang on. 11% of Canadians attend any form of religious service, even monthly. And again, if you want to narrow that down to Christians who attend monthly, we're going down to minuscule numbers, which means that it's not that, because we all tend to live in our largely Christian bubbles, people talk a lot about, the specter of Canada becoming post-Christian. We became post-Christian quite some time ago by every single number. 89% of Canadians attend no worship services at all, even monthly, nothing at all, which means that when we're trying to communicate with people, we need to actually communicate with them in terms they understand and with arguments that they find compelling. I don't see this actually as hiding the truth, because all truth is God's truth, and if I'm speaking the truth, it's His. because there's no such thing as secular truth. So we need to use the arguments that are most compelling to the people that they're speaking with. The first argument that I think is very important for us to discuss is the slippery slope argument. Now, can anybody tell me what the slippery slope fallacy is? That was one of their garbage arguments. But I mean, can you define the slippery slope fallacy specifically? You're giving an example of it. Yeah, so the slippery slope, so when the debate surrounding euthanasia and assisted suicide was taking place, what pro-life people like ourselves said was, if you legalize this, here is what's going to happen. That it's constantly going to be expanded. You're going to offer this service to more and more and more people. People are going to die because of mistakes that are made. And even worse, people are going to die when it was no mistake. They're going to say, I live a life not worth living anymore, and the government will say, I agree with you, ready when you are. We predicted this would happen by pointing to what takes place in Belgium, where people have been, for example, euthanized after botched sex change surgeries because they didn't like the way they looked anymore and felt so horrified about themselves that they opted instead to die. We see the same thing in the Netherlands, where one fellow in his early 50s who had just struggled with drinking too much decided he was sick of that struggle. He had a party with his friends, and then he invited a doctor over in one of their roving euthanasia vans and got a double lethal injection. We pointed out that these things would happen, and the government insisted that the response to the slippery slope argument was safeguards. We just need to put safeguards in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. But there's a reason I think it's important to point out that the slippery slope argument we made was never the slippery slope fallacy. They would say, oh, you're just trying to make the case that this is wrong because things will naturally happen as the result of it. And I made the case all along that the slippery slope argument was never the slippery slope fallacy because it was demonstrably true. When you make the case that if we legalize euthanasia and assisted suicide, these things will happen, you're not just saying because the logical consequences of saying that some people have the right to die means that you're going to ever expand that right. What you're actually saying is, no, everywhere this has been legalized and everywhere that this has started to happen, these things have happened. It's not a fallacy. It's a demonstrable truth with demonstrable case studies from the Netherlands to Belgium and on and on and on. And I think it's important to point that out because there are a lot of people who accept the extreme argument and then are horrified to discover where that argument leads. Abortion is another good example of this. The vast majority of people in this country are closer to our position on abortion than to Justin Trudeau's. But they are of the opinion that this only happens in a small set of circumstances, that abortion is necessary for a series of horrifying situations. But 80% of Canadians, for example, have no idea that abortion is legal all the way until birth. 80% do not know what the legal status quo is. The vast majority of them are horrified by the concept of late-term and even second trimester abortions, and most of them, if they truly understood the position of the Prime Minister and the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, would be truly horrified by it. I can tell you that for a fact. We door knock and have these discussions with Canadians across the GTA every single week. And most of the convincing takes place because they don't actually believe us when we tell us what the status quo in Canada is. And you actually have to pull it up and show them because they're like, there's no way that's true. And the same thing is true with assisted suicide. The way assisted suicide was sold was, imagine somebody who's got roughly 48 hours left to live. They're choking to death on their own fluids. They're dying a horrifying death of cancer. And all you're doing by not offering them a lethal injection is prolonging their pain. How dare you, you awful person, right? Why does your evil God want people to suffer longer than they need to? That was the argument that was made in favor of it. But nobody was on board with expanding suicide to those who suffer from suicidal ideation or those who are struggling with mental health crises. Except, of course, for those who were in mental health crises and were asking for it. And we used to recognize that a humane society didn't respond to somebody who was suicidal by affirming that desire. And so it's important for us to point out where this euthanasia regime, where this assisted suicide regime is leading, because the majority of Canadians are not on board. And I know it's disappointing and frustrating often to look at what people actually think versus what our government does, and I could give you a separate and very long and much angrier presentation on why it is that Canada's top tier is so completely airtight and why the will of the people is not reflected in our actual laws. but that's besides the point. The point here is just to highlight the fact that when we point out to people what is actually taking place in this country and why, most of them are horrified. One of the interesting things we see about this is one of the things that we have to do when we're examining those who are pioneering the legalization of things like assisted suicide, which everybody in this room is young enough to remember, and abortion, which only a handful of you in this room would actually remember the initial decriminalization of abortion, is you always have to look for the words that those seeking to mainstream these things don't want to use. So, for example, with the abortion debate, it's very simple, right? People who are advocating for abortion do not want to talk about abortion, they want to talk about choice, because everybody loves choices. Nobody opposes having lots of choices. So they want to talk about choice. They do not want to talk about what is being chosen, because then the horrifying reality about abortion is actually exposed to them, the fact that it's a brutal act of violence that decapitates, dismembers, and disembowels a developing human being in the womb. People change their mind when they come face to face with the reality of what abortion actually is. And so they don't actually want to talk about abortion. They want to talk about choice. That's why, with our work at CCBR, we talk about abortion. We don't talk about choice. We all agree that some choices are right and some choices are wrong. So that's not really relevant to the discussion about what we're going to do about feticide. The same thing is true for those who are advocating for the euthanasia regime that exists and advocating for its expansion. Now, does anybody tracking this debate, has anybody noticed which word they don't want to use? No, they don't want to use that one, but that's not the one I'm looking for. What I'm saying is that, pardon me? Suicide. Now, one of the interesting things, and I'd love to know exactly how they pull this off, but I saw the day when it shifted. Because during the debate early on, it was about euthanasia, right? Which is actually Greek for good death, which is a particularly perverse way of referring to it, because when you say that in order for somebody to die with dignity, they have to die faster, you're making a fundamental judgment call about the value of people's lives at certain stages and with certain illnesses. But they stopped using the word euthanasia soon enough, and they started using the word assisted suicide. It was medical assisted suicide was one of the terms that was used by the CBC, the Toronto Star, the CTV. It was used by all of the corporate media, now faithfully funded by the government just to ensure fairness. Then one day I noticed that it was medical aid in dying. And I was like, that's interesting. Why has it gone from medically assisted suicide to medical aid in dying? Why did they replace suicide with dying? And then, of course, it turned into MAID, right? We have to have an acronym to cover up the pile of corpses. That's what we always do. And the reason for that is because there is not a single person in this country who actually hears the word suicide and makes any positive association. When they hear the word suicide, they think of a person they know who's felt suicidal. And they either feel heartbroken that that person successfully committed suicide, or they feel grateful that that person did not succeed. Or they remember the horrifying time when they tried to talk somebody out of it. Or they remember when somebody they deeply, deeply loved was so despairing they wanted to end their own lives. That is what they think of when they hear the word suicide. There is nobody who has a positive association with the word suicide. And so, for the Death with Dignity activists to travel about the country, getting Canadians on board with an ever-expansive regime of suicide, the first thing they had to do was make sure we didn't use that word. Because you were never going to glamorize suicide. And trust me, like not just the mainstream media, but even Hollywood is trying, right? If you look at the last 10, 15 years, you have all of these major shows and films that were trying to make suicide look glamorous, sometimes even sexy, definitely compassionate, right? You had Clint Eastwood's $1 Million Baby. Then you had all the medical shows. So take Dr. House, right? He offs a couple of people almost every season. And there's always a long, drawn-out and soul-searching ethical discussion when he inevitably decides that killing them is for sure the right thing. It's a foregone conclusion, right? And then they'll even have these ethical discussions where they conflate withdrawal or cessation of treatment with active killing, which, of course, it's not the same thing, but this is Hollywood, and they have a message to tell you, and the truth doesn't need to get in the way of that. Then there was a couple of movies very recently, the most repulsive of which was called Me Before You. And in this one, they have a disabled man who falls in love with a girl, and they have this great relationship, and For almost, one of my colleagues went and watched it. For almost the entire film, you think, wow, what a life-affirming film, proving that even with his disability, he's still capable of love and of receiving love from someone, who actually falls in love with him. Then at the very end of the film, he decides to kill himself because he doesn't want to be a burden on her. And this is presented as a really noble decision on his part to not burden her, with the horrible, horrible task of loving somebody who couldn't walk. That's the way the film ended. And this was like a sexy romantic comedy Hollywood film where suicide was the final and last act of love and devotion. Right? This is utterly contemptible stuff. Anybody who knows anybody who's ever experienced suicidal ideation should have done things that are probably less than legal in response to this kind of trash that's being peddled to us. And again, I know many, many people who have suffered with suicidal ideation and some who still do. And the idea that this is the message being pumped out by our culture, when they're saying, I don't think my life is worth living, and the message from the culture, from both the mainstream and the government is, I agree with you, it's not. Right? This is disgusting stuff. This is really disgusting stuff. And we should not treat it with any level of respect whatsoever. We should treat it with contempt, and we should ask them why they support suicide for suffering people. And when they try to monopolize this person's suffering and say, I speak with the voice of compassion, which used to come with self-sacrificial action towards those who needed it, and now apparently comes at the end of a needle, we should point out the logical consequences of what they are actually advocating when they do this. I'll give you an example I first used in a debate on this subject, and I was probably a little bit more worked up than I should have been. But I really do think that as horrifying and dehumanizing as rhetoric around abortion is, and the way it's used to kill innocent preborn human beings, this government-sanctioned, when it comes to abortion, they at least have a decent enough conscience to lie about it and pretend it's not a baby, right? We point out it's killing a baby, they're like, it's not killing a baby. And so the argument is about what's actually happening during the abortion, right? But they have the decency, at least, to pretend they're not doing the thing that they're doing. When it comes to assisted suicide, they are openly attempting to mainstream self-extinction as a positive course. They're not even trying to hide what they're doing. And what they do is they talk about equality and rights, right? This is a bitter joke. One of the things I asked the interviewer when he said this is about equality, right? And I said, okay, well, let's look at this. So I don't have any history of mental illness. I've never taken antidepressants. I wouldn't take a psychiatric evaluation for other reasons. But I've never been formally diagnosed with any mental illness. Now, if I went in and I applied for medical aid in dying or government-facilitated assisted suicide, they would review my records, they would look at my physical and mental health, and then they would say, well, no, you don't qualify under any of these guidelines. Then let's take my father, who's been on antidepressants since 23 years old. He has a long history of working with a psychiatrist. He's got a very successful marriage, a very successful business. He's got 5 kids who all love him very much. He's got 9 grandkids, all under the age of 4. He, loves kids, and his children responded with an enthusiastic burst of procreation that makes his life more worth living. Now, he could walk into a hospital, and he could present his psychiatric records and his records of medication, and he could say, I'm experiencing a horrible downswing, which happens to everybody with chronic depression during different periods. Sometimes the medication stops working. Sometimes it's not strong enough. Sometimes outside circumstances re-trigger the illness. And he could say, I'd like to apply for assisted suicide. And they would review his records, and under the law coming into effect in 2023, but already being performed by many overeager physicians, they would say, right this way, the doctor will kill you now. He could actually opt for same-day assisted suicide. Now, in what universe am I equal to my dad in a society that refuses me this right, but grants it to him? There's this perverse idea that we get some choice in the matter. But if this is about choice, then why don't I get to pick? Why does he get to pick? It's because he's been pre-approved for suicide. Any of you who suffer from mental illness, you've been pre-approved for suicide. I have not. This is not about you making a choice or a judgment call. This is a choice the government already made for you. They're saying ready when you are. They're saying if you suffer from this, and you don't think your life is worth living, we agree with you. We don't think it's worth living either. And we actually agree with you so much that, again, we will pay for the procedure. We will provide the procedure. Because body bags are cheaper than palliative care. And euthanasia is a lot cheaper than improving our system of psychiatric care and ensuring those who struggle with mental illness get what they actually want. While we can continue patting ourselves on the back as a country that provides universal health care, while thousands of people die deaths of despair because our government would rather offer suicide to those people than actually put the money into it. We discovered in the last 2 years that when we really want to, we can spend trillions of dollars on all kinds of trash. Right? We can pay people to stay home. But when it comes to trying to fund psychiatric care from which people are dying, and I'm not even trying to make any political point about the pandemic. It's not a wise thing to do in any audience. The point I'm simply making is that when we really decide something worth the spending money on, we burn it by the truckload. And I would like to suggest that considering the rates of mental illness and the levels of psychiatric care across Canada, when you're waiting for a couple of years in Alberta and at least 2 in Ontario, maybe it's time we spent some money on that. Because right now we have a tiny percentage of people who have access to psychiatric or palliative care and 100% access to MAID. And our response to these crises, like for example, the mental health crisis that is following the pandemic, just as mental health professionals predicted, is we're expanding medical aid in dying. Like, this is absolute garbage. This is contemptible, and we should not treat this with any level of respect. So, again, as I pointed out before, the government has made this choice for you. Some of you are pre-approved for assisted suicide, some of you are not. However, when we're having the discussion with people, what we actually found, and this is where I suppose the encouragement comes in, you were probably wondering where that was going to make an appearance, so I'll do my best here, is that after a 10 to 15-minute conversation, so right now roughly 70% of Canadians accept or support euthanasia as they understand it, which is somebody, dying in horrifying pain at the end of a long battle with cancer. That's how they see euthanasia. The same way that they see abortion as something that a victim of sexual assault or incest or somebody in horrifying circumstances opts for. That's how they see abortion as well. But after a 10-minute conversation, we see almost an inverse, and a majority of people oppose assisted suicide or euthanasia. A majority. We've had polling on this. So the bad news is the vast majority of people support euthanasia and assisted suicide. The good news is that this is not only changeable, but we've actually seen and tested this. Professional Canadian pollsters have indicated that a large number of Canadians, a majority in fact, are willing to change their mind when presented with the sorts of facts that we're discussing here. So one of the things that's important to do, because when you're trying to reach people on an issue that's greatly contentious, what Christians and pro-lifers tend to do is to get very drony, right? So when you're going to have a discussion about assisted suicide or euthanasia, if you mention Aquinas or something like that, you've lost very, very badly. What we need to do is talk to a generation of people raised on screens who have the attention span of lab rats and have actually been lab rats in a very fascinating media experiment for the last 30 years, and to actually attempt to communicate with them in terms they understand, but that yet still make our case in a compelling and solid way. So, for example, during our pro-life work, the argument that we have found works the best is to simply point out that human beings have human rights. Human rights begin when the human being begins. Science tells us when the human being begins, and as such, abortion is a human rights violation. All pro-lifers are really doing is advocating for science-based legislation, which we are told over and over again that we should trust. And so, the same thing must be applied to assisted suicide. The first thing we need to do, as I pointed out, is actually explain what this regime is doing, right? This regime is not allowing people in horrible stages of suffering to end their lives 24 hours earlier than they would have died naturally. This is like 61-year-old, pretty young mothers, being able to access it 48 hours after it being requested against the wishes of their entire family, who would like to secure them the assistance denied to them by pandemic restrictions. That is actually what we're talking about, and it's important to bring these things up because none of us are immune to this happening in our families. Again, you all know people who have had suicidal ideation. You all know people who have experienced despair. And now this regime is going to be open to them in a way that it never has before. So this touches us more intimately in many ways than abortion does, right? A lot of churches ignored abortion because they thought that was a problem out there rather than in here. This changes things dramatically because those whose reasoning organ is affected by an illness can now have the opportunity to use that organ to make a life-threatening decision. Second of all, we have to use the word they don't want to use, and we have to use it incessantly. We have to use the word suicide all the time. That's what this is about. This is not about euthanasia, a good death. This isn't about medical aid in dying. They didn't die, they were killed, and there's a difference. And any sane, reasonable person understands the difference between dying and being killed. Or at least we used to. Right? You want, like, some of the horror stories, it's almost comical that they haven't come out. There was one euthanasia doctor in Vancouver who also runs an abortion clinic. So she's burning the candle at both ends. She runs an abortion clinic. She also performs euthanasias. There's a Jewish care home that does not permit assisted suicide on the premises. She snuck in with a lethal injection in her bag and euthanized the Jewish patient at his request, causing massive stress and post-traumatic stress disorder amongst all the patients, a decent number of whom were Holocaust survivors. Keeping in mind that the euthanasia was legalized by Nazi Germany under the T34 euthanasia program, and it remained illegal across the Western world until the Netherlands legalized it in the early 2000s. In between, we all agreed that the government choosing and then facilitating who should live and who should die was a terribly bad idea. So the entire question that we need to ask when it comes to the debate on assisted suicide is who gets assisted suicide and who gets suicide prevention, one of the two. Because that is fundamentally what this question is about. Because again, take me and my family member, me and my wife, for example, suffers on her side of the family, she suffers from depression as well. If we both walk into the same doctor's office and we both apply for MAID, and she's accepted and I'm denied, the government has decided who gets suicide assistance and who gets suicide prevention. I didn't decide. They decided. She didn't decide. They decided. People told me when this debate started that it was easier to debate abortion than assisted suicide because in the case of abortion, somebody was being killed and they didn't have a choice. And I agree with that to some extent. The abortion debate in moral terms is clean and black and white. We shouldn't kill innocent human beings. That's why we're against abortion. Yes, there's emotionally horrifying circumstances. Yes, there are crisis pregnancies, but we can all simply make the case that killing a human being is no response to suffering and no response to tragedy. Whereas in assisted suicide, they're like, yeah, but the person is choosing to die. How do we stop them? And it's fundamentally by making the point that their choice didn't have anything to do with it. Again, they were pre-approved. We are pre-approved for a mortgage or a loan. Some of us are pre-approved for assisted suicide. Others are not. Who here thinks that's a choice? We don't all get it. I don't know which of you would qualify and which of you wouldn't. But I know that not all of you qualify, and I know that some of you do. And I know that you didn't decide whether or not you qualified. You didn't decide. That decision was made for you. So all this trash about choice and how empowering it is that we get to choose, no, what the government has done is they've drawn a red line through the population. On one side, are citizens so valuable that if they decide to commit suicide or if they try, the cops will get called, they'll get restrained, they'll get put in the hospital, psychiatric unit on suicide watch to make sure they don't die. Right? That's what the government will do to make sure that you're protected if you're on one side of that red line. On the other side of that line are people whose lives have already been deemed by the government as so fundamentally worthless that if you ask for assisted suicide, they will not only not try to stop you, they will tell you that it is your right to die, and then they'll pay for the lethal injection and give you the doctor to do it. You might have to wait 3 years for a psychiatrist for the depression you're suffering from, but you can get a MAID doctor in 2 days. This has nothing to do with choice. I tend to repeat myself, you may have noticed. But I think that we're missing fundamental points about this debate. I do not think this debate is as complicated as people make it seem. It isn't. Because for every one story of a cancer survivor or somebody who's dying of cancer who has 2 days left and then decides for a lethal injection to spare them death by drowning on their own fluids, there are thousands of stories of young people crippled by depression who will soon have access to this. Because, by the way, that's the next thing they're discussing right now, is expanding assisted suicide to children. And again, follow the terminology. Has anybody heard what they're calling children now? Mature minors. Now, why do you think they've invented this new phrase, mature minors? Is it so they can buy cigarettes before the age of 19? Is it so they can drink earlier or vote or maybe drive? If you're a mature minor, you can probably decide who to vote for. You're a mature minor, you can probably drive earlier than the rest. No, you're a mature minor, so you can decide to kill yourself against the wishes of your parents. That is what they mean by mature minor. Again, it's so perverse because, look, they can't say, let's let kids get assisted suicide, or even kids get made. People are like, children, kids. There's a lot of people on board with a lot of stuff, but the second you bring up kids, everybody kind of gets a little bit nervous, right? It's the whole reason that the Cultural Revolution in the U.S. got really, really far, and now you're seeing parental pushback because everybody was fine with a lot of stuff. They were fine with redefining a lot of stuff and chucking a lot of stuff, but they were like, you stay away from the kids, though. That's sort of generally agreed upon. And when it turns out that you're not going to or you're not planning to, everything changes. And that's why we have to call them mature minors, because we can't call them kids. We can't call them children. We can't talk about assisted suicide for children. What kind of moral monster advocates for allowing kids to kill themselves? Mature minors, though, responsible, ethical, sane human beings can debate that on proper terms. And if we use words that are big enough, we can hide a whole stack of kids' corpses behind them, which is a completely different way of looking at it. And they're going to try to do it, and there's nothing stopping them, and there's no good reason to think that the Canadian court system is actually going to stop them, because the Carter decision, which was unanimous and overturned their previous cases on euthanasia, was given to us by a roster of judges appointed almost entirely by Stephen Harper. In fact, the last 3 major Supreme Court decisions that screwed over social conservatives were all made by judges appointed not by Trudeau, by Harper. Which I think is really important, because there's a lot of people who are really big fans of Pierre Poilievre, who's a Harper clone. He voted against protecting babies in the womb if they were girls. He voted for Bill C-4 and Bill C-6. He voted for the most dangerous legislation restricting religious liberty that there is. And you're voting for your pocketbooks to get fattened somewhat, but for the moral poverty of the country to increase. And it really frustrates me when I watch people who care so much about these issues are like, that guy, he's really good. I'm like, he's just like Harper. How do you think we got euthanasia? Yeah, Trudeau made it worse, as Trudeaus do. That's their family legacy. They make stuff worse. But Harper is the guy who gave us the judges who gave us the euthanasia regime we live in now, right? And it's important for us to remember that so we're clear-eyed about what it is we're talking about. Now, I want to give you an example before I take questions on how perverse it is that our new assisted suicide regime turns on its head everything we previously understood about suicidal ideation. Because what we previously understood is that somebody who expressed a desire for suicide is that this was a cry for help. That people who really wanted to kill themselves went and did it. But if people told you they felt suicidal, they were giving you an opportunity to help them. They were giving you an opportunity to talk them out of it. They were giving you an opportunity to beg them to do everything you could in their power to keep them alive. The most successful suicides, the ones where they attempt it and it works, is when they haven't told anybody, is when they just go and they do it. But where we see the most people that are saved is when they tell somebody that they're experiencing suicidal ideation. And very often, it's not just, I have suicidal ideation, talk me out of it. It's just, I want to die, I'm going to kill myself. And what do they want to hear when they say, I want to kill myself? Very simple, don't go, I love you. That's all. That's what most of them want to hear. And the government response now is when somebody expresses something out loud, the response is right this way. Let me read you a story from 2014. I remember copying it into a Word document when I saw it because it summarizes almost everything wrong with this debate. I'm going to quote to you directly from the article. An elderly husband and wife have announced their plans to die in the world's first couple euthanasia despite neither of them being terminally ill. Instead, the pair fear loneliness if the other one dies first from natural causes. Identified only by their first names, Francis, 89, and Anne, 86, and they have the support of their 3 adult children who say they would be unable to care for either parent if they were widowed. The children have even gone so far as to find a practitioner willing to carry out the double killings on the grounds that the couple's mental anguish constituted the unbearable suffering needed to legally justify euthanasia. The couple's daughter has remarked that her parents are talking about their deaths as eagerly as if they were going on a holiday. John Paul, their son, said the double euthanasia of his parents was the best solution Instead, if one of them should die, the one who would remain would be so sad and so totally dependent on us, it would be impossible for us to come here every day and to take care of our mother and our father. Does anybody want to identify the problem in that article? Yes, sir. There's that, and there's actually been articles published in mainstream news sources who are occasionally right, explicitly stating that there are a lot of people, because you know what, with the level of care we have now, the money that parents have saved up can go towards keeping them alive for much longer than we ever could. It's one of the few good things about living in this particular century is that the people we love can live longer than they used to. So that's true. When I read this article, I remember thinking, if I wanted to know if my kids loved me and if they wanted me around, a good way of putting it would be like, I think that instead of burdening you with me and mom's presence, I think that we're just instead going to apply for assisted suicide when you're older, right? And I would bet these parents were hoping against hope that their kids would tell them, don't be insane, right? Of course we'll take care of you. It's not a burden, right? We love you. We can't imagine our lives without you, and we need you to stay here to enjoy us, to enjoy your grandkids, right? Like, our life will be less without you in it. But instead, they said, well, we'll just opt for couples euthanasia, and the response from their kids were, good idea. I'd want to kill myself too if I had kids like that. I'm not saying I'd go through with it. I think that's very immoral, but you know what I'm saying. Right? But like, this story is reported in the media, and nobody points out the fact that this couple suggested that they might commit suicide. Just spitballed the idea. And it was the response of other people that persuaded them, yes, this is the case. We used to understand that somebody who said, I want to kill myself, was crying for help. Somebody tell me to stay. Somebody tell me not to go. Somebody tell me they love me. And instead, nobody said that. I'll help you. I'll help you find the doctor, their son said, right? That's what he said. My grandfather died last year at the age of 99, surrounded by 9 of his 11 kids. His 2 of them couldn't make it there quite in time. My son was his 136th great-great-grandson. And there was a couple of hundred of us by the time he went. And I remember thinking, like, especially when it comes to this discussion, you know, it's weird when you tell somebody your grandfather died and you're grieving about it, and he was 99, and you're almost like, okay, well, he was almost 100 years old. But it doesn't get easier to lose somebody just because you've loved them longer. Sure, we didn't think we'd get him to almost the age of 100, but it means, like, you know, I'm greedy when it comes to my loved ones. I want more time with them, not less. I loved him longer, and so I miss him more. And the idea that his life was worth less at the very, very end is just such a vile and subhuman idea. The whole assisted suicide regime is not just wrong to me. It's not just morally wrong to me. It's fundamentally offensive to me. Everything it says about so many of the people I love, it's gross, and I think anybody can understand that, because despite how far we've strayed from faith, despite how degraded our culture has become, thank God we all still have people that we love. And that is why we on this debate can connect with people. We can share that with them. We can explain to them that the government has made this choice for some of their loved ones already, maybe for them. This is not about choice. This is not about freedom. This is about a fundamental failure to love people as we are supposed to. I do not think this is very hard to understand for most people. I don't think that we need to say, God told you to love people. We all love people without ever having been told by anybody to do it. And at the same time, I think we need to do a better job of just communicating this to people. That is, I think, the only answer. It's going to get, the legal regime in Canada is going to get worse. There are no brakes on this train. And that means it's the responsibility of the church, which it always has been for a couple of thousand years, to speak up when nobody else will. And the good news is, I think, in a world that's very dark and often starved for these sorts of things, there are a lot of people that are very, very willing to listen. Every argument we use here, we watch people change their minds in less than 15 minutes on campus. Because people want to hear something other than, you know what? Like, one of the things I think of is all these left-wing movements over the last 50, 60 years, a lot of them would have been a lot of fun, right? For a certain sort of person with the right amount of drugs in your system, Woodstock must have been a blast, right? You know, fighting for liberation and tearing all these things down, I can understand what was in it for people, but this is where it's ended. It's campaigning for the right of people to have a lethal injection, right? Campaigning for the right of people who were suicidal to commit suicide, right? The fun's over, the party has long subsided, and now people are starting to realize where all of this leads. And where it leads is death. And fortunately, we have the answers. We have the answers for them. And I hope that a few of these things that I've said today will give you answers in your discussions with people. For anybody who's interested in the formal layout of all the arguments, again, there's a little book. It's very cheap, and it's quite short. It's a guide to discussing assisted suicide. It's probably a lot shorter than me when I'm speaking. And the arguments are street tested, and you'll find them very effective in conversations with your peers. Yeah, so what you just referred to isn't euthanasia, right? If somebody has cancer, they have the decision whether or not to pursue radiation and chemotherapy or whether or not to allow the cancer to take its course. That's not euthanasia, right? The doctor didn't give them cancer. And we actually have a section on our book that emphasizes that the pro-life position is not vitalism. And vitalism means keep everyone alive at all costs, no matter what. And that is not the case. So again, this isn't really hard to distinguish in simple terms. I would just point out that when we die of natural causes, it's not the same thing as being killed. And that one is not euthanasia and one is, right? If you die of cancer, you didn't kill yourself. If you put a gun to your head and pull the trigger, you did. This is not a very difficult distinction to make. And we are not arguing whatsoever that somebody who is sick can refuse treatment at a certain point. And in fact, almost everyone who is facing a terminal illness will have to have a discussion at some point about when you cease treatment, like when you want to keep going. And different families make different decisions, and they make those with their family members and with God. So no, it's not at all the same thing. There's a totally different distinction. And I think being opposed to assisted suicide and euthanasia has nothing to do with promoting this idea that you have to stay alive at all costs. Well, the CBC in 2016 published an in-depth investigation into how much money assisted suicide was going to save our healthcare system every year. Because one of the things that we have right now is we abort 100,000 babies a year. We have not been having children at the replacement level for 2 generations now, which basically means that you have an aging generation that has not had the children to replace themselves, so fewer taxpayers are paying into the healthcare system, which means the healthcare system's falling apart, which basically means you want people on the conveyor belt faster, or the system is going to break. And even immigration cannot replace. They've been trying with immigration to essentially replace the babies that people aren't having, and that's not even working. They can't get them in fast enough. And so as such, in introducing assisted suicide and then encouraging people to pursue it, which they are doing, means that you're going to save an enormous amount of money. If somebody, for example, is in the final stages of cancer, and without requesting assisted suicide, they would live for 6 to 8 more months, right? That is an enormous number of healthcare dollars. Palliative care is an enormous amount of money. I know many people personally, and I'm sure most of you do too, who have gone through the palliative process, right? It's an extraordinary amount of money, time, hours, energy, love spent on these people. If they take a lethal injection 6 months earlier, right, everybody is spared a ton of cash and time and professional work. And this is not an implicit, I don't have to speculate that this is being thought of, because the CBC wrote it. And you guys may be aware of the CBC. It's funded by the government. And you pay your money to them to give to the CBC so they can tell us why it's better off that some of us die faster. So they openly explain why this is the case. They did so in the Netherlands as well. The Netherlands has had panels where they openly discuss the fact that assisted suicide is necessary to ease the strain of an aging population on the healthcare system. They actually proposed passing a completed life law. A completed life law meant that you could hit age 65, and then the government was like, ready when you are. Like once you're past 65, you can kill yourself whenever. So yeah, these things are being openly discussed. It's what I mean, like abortion, they still hide what it's all about. Assisted suicide, I find the discussion brazen and open in terms of what they're doing. No, very helpful. I think we should let the politicians know at every stage, because MPs, once they get a certain number of letters on something, then they suddenly decide to care, right? which is irritating, but also, I think, illustrative. We need to contact them. A lot of people who are very pro-choice and very pro the whole LGBT agenda, et cetera, are very wobbly on this issue because of what I just discussed about suicide and everybody knowing people who have suicidal ideation, right? Like, don't ask me what I think of Aaron O'Toole, because I shouldn't say most of it, but he was very opposed to his assisted suicide because he knows his mother, his mother died of cancer when he was a boy, and she was offered assisted suicide under the table. And he remembers his mother saying, no, I want to spend these last months with my boy. And he knows how much those months meant to him. So I think that on this issue, we have a real opportunity to reach people in a way that is more difficult with other issues. So any level of political engagement, I think, is really, really important. Talk to somebody. Talk to somebody. Talk to somebody about it. When it comes to the different political things you can do change constantly. I see right now it's supposed to have a table. They're very, very good on this. Honestly, like the first political solution is going to be more funding for psychiatric and palliative care and facilitating it hard, because at the end of the day, that's one of the huge problems. And one of the difficulties about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, not to fire up Dr. Masson up here, is the reality is that almost every major moral shift in the last 25 years has not been voted through in Parliament, but has been approved by the Supreme Court, right? So again, euthanasia was not legalized by the MPs, and Parliament wouldn't have touched the issue if they didn't have to. It was forced on them by the Harper-appointed Supreme Court. Same thing is true for any number of other recent issues. And so, politically speaking, what we can do is limited. We can talk about safeguards, but yeah, we are limited. Well, there's possibility and then there's likelihood, right? I think that Dr. Leslie Lewis, who feels who opposes assisted suicide all the way down, would definitely be a powerful voice on this. I have no idea if other candidates, say like Pierre Poilievre, who is sort of a one-trick pony and inflation is his main game. I'm not sure what he thinks on this issue particularly. What I do know is that he is one of the many conservatives who thinks that moral issues are just sort of an irritating thing they have to occasionally discuss, and that's problematic. So one of the issues social conservatives have had for quite a long time now is we don't really have any political voices that have been articulating these things in the public square in a way that forces the government to cover them. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's likely, because again, too, the Carter case gives us such an expansive definition of what the right to assisted suicide is. And I really do think that what we're seeing in Western civilization in general is all the safeguards that were erected by living in a Judeo-Christian civilization are being torn away. And increasingly, it's up to us to protect the vulnerable, to talk to our loved ones, to create solid communities, because the protections that existed for the weak and the vulnerable in societies based on that foundation are one by one falling away. Not that I'm aware of. High schools are notoriously difficult to get into on issues that are considered political. And the problem we have with issues of like assisted suicide and abortion is I don't consider them inherently political issues, but what you often end up having is the clergy will say these are political issues, so we can't talk about them. The politicians are like, these are moral issues, we can't talk about them, and then all the corpses pile up in between and everybody ignores it. And so it puts us in this impossible position where the religious say it's political and the political say it's religious, and everybody gets a cop-out and they don't have to talk about it. And so I think that it's really important that we do talk about these things, because if we don't, nobody else is going to. And with abortion, we have a moral obligation to talk about it, because we have a moral obligation to talk about those who are being killed without a voice. When it comes to euthanasia and assisted suicide, right? Like, is anybody born more vulnerable than somebody who's suicidal? Right? Like, not many. And nobody's speaking for them right now. They're championing their right to kill themselves as just another glorious expansion of the Charter. So we need to talk about it. And again, I think this should get plugged directly into every suicide prevention course in every high school, everywhere. This should not be, this is not rocket science. And if people say it's religious, they're just, they're admitting something I don't think they want to make. It's like, well, that's a religious issue. If you think that only the religious can give hope to the suicidal, then you're admitting something about your worldview and you're complementing mine. Now they do. Yeah. Palliative, you are correct. Palliative care is not assisted suicide, but now they're referring to assisted suicide as end-of-life care. And so they offer a suicide as one of the options. Yeah, you know what? I heard a psychiatrist, Dr. John Mayer, one of the best psychiatrists in the country, give a talk, and he's like, there is no such thing as pain we cannot address in 2022. Whether it's mental or physical, there's no such thing. I'll give you an example. One of my friends goes to an old age home often, and they go to sing, and she'd play her guitar and that kind of stuff. And she noticed on one of the boards that one of the female residents had applied for assisted suicide. She went and talked to this person, didn't mention anything, asked what she always liked to do, and she said she'd always liked to play Scrabble, but nobody really showed up and played games with her anymore. So she's like, well, why don't we make a date for Thursday? So they started playing Scrabble every Thursday, and after 3 sessions, she took her name off of consideration. That is literally all it took, right? When people are dying deaths of despair because they're lonely and nobody cares, that's on us. That's a reflection of how our society works. So this is one of the things I say to high school students too, right? Like, get off your stupid phone and go visit your grandparents. They're much more interesting. They were alive a lot longer than you. Like, there's so many people want to die for reasons that can be changed. Well, the science on that's been established for a very long time. What they're trying to do is make the case that some people's suffering is so great that they should be able to make the decision. And the mature minors is not a term rooted in science. It's literally invented just to facilitate the suicide of young people. We know that a young man's brain is fully developed around the age of 25, and a girl's brain is developed a couple of years before that, to no surprise. And like, we've known this for a very long time, right? And so to make the case that they should be permitted to make this decision prior to that, they're using mature minors to allow people to, like kids, to go on puberty blockers and get sex changes and stuff like that too, right? There is no non-sinister use of the phrase mature minors. Interestingly enough, the one who's been doing this most successfully is Jordan Peterson, because he has been coming at it from a secular point of view, but he's trying to point out that, like, life is suffering, that we will all suffer. That people you love will die, and that we need to be prepared for these things, and that we need a structure of meaning that allows us to see these things and to not despair, right? It's kind of funny because I'm Reformed. A lot of my Catholic friends are like, he's for sure going to become Catholic. I'm like, look at his face. He's going to become Russian Orthodox if he converts. Because all he can talk about is suffering, right? But I think he actually teaches Christians a lot of lessons about, is there meaning in suffering? And the thing is, too, is that we can also give people's suffering meaning, and I believe that completely, right? Like with my grandparents, for example, they still got to be around with all of us. We were there, like holding their hands to the last minute, talking to them. Like, love doesn't conquer everything, but it conquers most things, right? And especially now with the medication that they have, like, when it comes to the broader community where families have been, like, beyond ruptured by the sexual revolution, what we're seeing, as Mary Eberstadt said, is the greatest scattering and greatest rupture of human beings outside the time of warfare or famine in recorded human history. And it's usually self-inflicted family breakup. I do think Christians should be taking choirs and singing for the old people. They should be going into old age homes and giving them something to look forward to regularly. I do think we need to do that, because people who've been abandoned in these warehouses for the elderly, and have nothing to look forward to, should at least be able to look forward to Christians showing up and putting a smile on their faces. In terms of our own families, one of the reasons I hate the internet so much, and it's a very long list, is the fact that it distracts us from the actual people around us in general, right? Like, I was at my grandparents' house once, and some of my cousins, like, looking at social media. I'm like, your grandmother remembers the war. There's nothing on Facebook and the tyranny of the present that's nearly as interesting as stuff she has to say. So we need to do a better job of communicating real human face-to-face relationships with the people who love us the most, not these garbage screens with people who aren't our friends. Like, it's one of the things that I hate the most, just because it's purports to connect us, but we're being disconnected. And I think the elderly suffer the most, because, like, my grandfather at the end of his life, the last several years, and my grandmother now, who's 95 and survived him, she's not useful to a young person in any sense that we perceive it, right? She can't walk very well. She doesn't know how to communicate like she used to. So the only thing you can do is love her. That's it. I can't have any scintillating arguments and conversations with her anymore, right? She's not bringing in my life any inherent value except for the fact that I love her and she loves me, and that's all that's left at this stage in her life and at this stage in her dementia. But we need to get back to a Christianity and to a family life that realizes that's good enough. It's good enough for me to fly across the country. Because if that's all I can do for her and it's all she can do in return, it's worth the flight, right? So we need to go back to simple first principles.
Thank you so much for joining us for this featured presentation, and we invite you to join us at the next Life Talks conference in person, so mark it on your calendar.